Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lempar, your regular host, and today I'm again joined by my co-host in this series of episodes, we're now up to the fourth one, by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young. So on the last episode, we talked to the forward observation line and the strategic conditions behind the requirement to maintain that forward observation line in Lark Force and GOL Force up in Timor, Ambon and Rabaul. Many in the last few episodes between when we last recorded have argued that as soon as they worked out how difficult it will be and warfare will be, they took the job far more seriously. I think Brigadier James Davis talking about not being able to fudge the realities of warfare, and DCA doing much the same, and talking to the fact that you know, where we lack experience in command, we should read widely. And I suppose an extension of reading is this podcast and some audio that we're going to go through with case studies. This episode itself, we use Lark Force in Rabaul to describe how hard the conditions were, and also zoom in from the more strategic level, you know, talking about that forward observation line and chiefs of staff and all that sort of stuff. If you haven't listened to the episode, please go back. But this one's going to zoom right into the tactical considerations behind an experience of command in isolation and how difficult the environment and the enemy is to defeat in those circumstances. Last episode, sir, you made the argument that, or the claim that a battalion group with better leadership may have been able to mount a more successful guerrilla campaign in Rabaul. I suppose we're going to tease that out today and talk about how successful, well, the ultimate question is how successful it would have been with a different command team. And just before we go into it, I'm going to just acknowledge the source, which is Bruce Gamble. The book is Invading Rabaul, the epic story of Lark Force, the forgotten garrison. It's an absolutely amazing read, incredibly emotive. And if you're going to go back to the DCA's original argument that reading more widely will give you an understanding of what the conditions are going to be like, this is the perfect book. So first, I suppose we start with a ground brief and talk about why Rabaul, but more so what Rabaul looks like in this forward observation line.
Yeah, absolutely, Todd. So the only thing I'd add to your intro as well is that I think it's really important to look at our defeats. So Rabaul is potentially one of the most shameful episodes in Australian martial history. So it's really important to look at from that perspective as well. Okay, so ground brief. Rabaul is a deep water port on the northeast of New Britain. In 1914, Australia had seized that location, which was part of German New Guinea, and it was the administrative centre for the north of New Guinea and the Australian territory that was. That point that it was a deep water port meant that you could, or from a Japanese perspective, you could go from the west into northern New Guinea. Or you could go east down through Bougainville and into the Solomon Island archipelago. So it is indeed key terrain. I want to run through then a timeline of what happened, so that we can then sort of pull out some of the lessons. And as you say, Bruce Gamble has written a really entertaining book, and you know, frankly, it gets a bit dark as we've sort of discussed this morning already. Okay, so in March 1941, so this is 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the decision is taken to reinforce Rabaul with a battalion group, and that group becomes known as Lark Force. So the first 700 troops arrive in March of 1941. Now, in June of 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy commence some reconnaissance flights. They are detected, but not too much thought is given into that, other than they know that, as in the Australians know, that Rabaul is seen as key terrain by the Japanese. In October 1941, then, we have a full colonel come in over the top of the lieutenant colonel. Now, the lieutenant colonel, Gamble says, was regarded as unfit for command at that level. And so they put this gentleman called Colonel Scanlan, and we'll get into him in some detail later, but he arrives in October. The other key thing about October is that the US recognise that it's also key terrain. And under Lend-Lease, they promise to deliver 6 7-inch coastal guns, 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 12 50 caliber machine guns to the Australians to upgrade the harbour defences that they already have. Okay, so that's a promise. Now, so going into December of 1941, I'll just run through what the ORBAT for Lark Force actually looked like. So we've got the 2nd 22nd Battalion. We've got 2 World War I vintage 6-inch coastal guns. We've got 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. And we've got a 2-pounder anti-tank detachment. And we've got the 2nd 10th Field Ambulance. Now, from an air perspective, we've got 10 Wirraways. The Wirraway was a US Texan trainer built under licence by the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. And we've got 4 Lockheed Hudsons. Now, the Lockheed Hudson, probably a lot of our listeners will have been to Canberra Airport. A Lockheed Hudson is the aircraft that sits in Canberra Airport on the Virgin Terminal side, if you're wondering what that aircraft is. So that's the situation heading into the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Okay, so 7th of December 1941, the US attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers and sink a whole bunch of battleships. They missed the aircraft carriers famously. You can read about that anywhere, really. Look up Wikipedia on Pearl Harbor. The key thing to note there is that in that moment, the US Lend-Lease promises for those 7-inch guns and the like, they evaporate. The US no longer has a capacity to provide anything as they scramble to understand what this conflict is going to look like. At the same time, the Philippines have been invaded, and they're going through their own problems. In December as well, the Australian War Cabinet decided that no further reinforcement of that Malaya barrier that we spoke about in terms of Ambon and Timor and Rabaul was to occur. And they also decided that no big ships were to be put at risk. So that is Australia's couple of heavy cruisers, and we had a few light cruisers as well at the time. So essentially, the Australian government at that point decides that the garrisons on those 3 islands are alone and that they're not actually going to risk anything further. No evacuation plan, in other words.
I think that's an awesome point because it sets the conditions for command, and we're going to get into that anyway. But I suppose there were times where the Australian government, the information of 2 enemy fleets approaching Rabaul was withheld a numerous amount of times, and I think the rationale behind that was, and if we try to fill in the gaps, was that everyone was better off not knowing what was going to occur. We spoke last episode about thousands and thousands of enemy forces coming in, and the presumption being that if they understood the threat in its entirety, that widespread panic might break out and sort of the end goal wouldn't be achieved. Yeah.
I think there's some really interesting questions there about what information you should be providing to your fighting forces. I mean, I think that a modern day look on that would see it as I see it as a massive betrayal by the government on that force to not even tell them what they thought they were up against. And we'll get into what they're up against in a second. But yeah, I agree, Matt. It's really interesting. Okay, so we're just on the eve of serious action in Rabaul. Should we take a little branch off into who Scanlan was?
Yeah, I think so. Just to define, I talked about the command component and sort of understanding the decisions that need to be made. But yeah, I think that's important to define what the organisation, I suppose, tone at the top of the organisation.
Yeah, okay. So Scanlan, I think is a really, really interesting character. So we will go into his actions, and if you looked at them in isolation, you would think, well, that's incredibly poor command. He must have been a coward or something similar. And I don't think you can't square that with his record through the First World War. So Scanlan was awarded a DSO and bar. So that's the equivalent of today's Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the First World War. He landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915, and he commanded battalions at both Amiens and also Mont St Quentin in 1918. So he's not a coward. There's something else going on there, and we might get into that in a second. But for the moment, I think that we can make the observation that the challenges of independent battalion group command are very, very different to effectively fighting your battalion as part of a corps level action on the Western Front.
And that's that. I suppose independence is one word, but complete isolation is another. You're basically completely isolated without any support. And we talked about, I think you made the argument that he's not a coward now, but we're going to talk about the conditions which would suggest that maybe he didn't make the best decisions at the time. But I think it's important to note that this is one of the hardest jobs that you'll ever be given, I suppose, is complete isolation without support, and then being withheld information about what the enemy disposition is going to be, and then starting to get to the point where they're refusing to use merchant ships to withdraw soldiers at the sort of when that threat was absolutely knocking at the front door.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was just soldiers. I think it was the non-combatants as well. They sort of turned around and said, no, the non-combatants are staying. Look, I agree. Let's get into the meat of it then. So on the 1st of January 1942, so we're sort of 3 weeks into the war in the Pacific, Scanlan gives 2 orders, and they're pretty cliched orders, is what I would say. He says, every man will fight to the last, and there shall be no withdrawal. Now, Gamble tells us that was incredibly poorly received by the soldiers, basically because it wasn't backed up with a plan. Would be my suggestion. What was the plan?
Or resources as well. Like we're talking about how we've got 2 6-inch guns for coastal defence and limited aircraft. Sort of resources and a plan not backing up those 2 vague statements, I suppose, I would imagine that they weren't confident.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Western forces aren't great with the concept of a suicidal defence, or when there is no tangible benefit. So soldiers will fight and die for something larger, but what is the larger in this circumstance, I guess? Now, the other thing that happened around that sort of 1st of January is that he had some excellent, it would seem, junior officers. So this is the lieutenants, captains, and even the majors of the force were pretty dynamic people. And one in particular sort of shines through in Gamble's narrative, a Captain Selby. Now, he proposed that they actually start caching food at set points throughout New Britain in order to enable a guerrilla campaign. Scanlan chastises Selby for being defeatist and refuses to do that at all. The interesting thing about that is that there are significant parallels between Scanlan and MacArthur here. MacArthur did something similar by refusing to cache food on the Bataan Peninsula through the late 1941 in the Philippines. So there's some interesting almost character traits of this generation of officer.
And I suppose that the idea was that when he did, Selby did attempt to cache food and start to contingency plan, which would be an excellent staff officer. He would be an excellent staff officer in that context. He was called defeatist. Like, again, leaning back to that idea that if we start to contingency plan, work through withdrawal routes, and there was absolutely no planning in terms of withdrawal without being engaged by aircraft or Navy. I suppose being called a defeatist and then being told to get back in your box, I suppose, was what he was told.
Yeah, which is obviously going to stifle initiative at that junior officer level. We can almost feel how that would have been received by the cohort of junior officers as part of Lark Force as they saw Selby torn down fairly publicly and being called defeatist. Probably the last thing that any officer wants to be called. Okay, so on the 4th of January then, we have the first Japanese air raids come through. They're based in the Caroline Islands up from Truk, and they're twin-engine bombers coming down. On the 9th of January, one of those Lockheed Hudsons that I mentioned basically flew a reconnaissance flight to Truk. It was a single aircraft that did it. Now, it spotted and photographed a large invasion fleet sitting at Truk. A whole bunch of transports were identified and cruisers and the like. Now, of course, at that point, they can't determine exactly where it's going, but they know that something is coming and probably south. On the 14th of January then, the Japanese fleet departs Truk. Now, that invasion fleet and the supporting warships there are 4 of the aircraft carriers that hit Pearl Harbor there. Now, each of those aircraft carriers, these are fleet aircraft carriers, the Akagi Kaga, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. They carry somewhere in the vicinity of 80 planes each, compared to our 10 Wirraways and 4 Lockheed Hudsons. They've got 7 cruisers. That's more than the entirety of the Royal Australian Navy at the time. 14 destroyers. And now Gamble has this great scene where this invasion fleet crosses the equator, and it's the first time that a Japanese invasion force has crossed the equator, and it's a massive deal for the Japanese, and they see it as a key milestone in the history of their empire. Great scene. Again, Gamble really brings this stuff to life. Also, in this period, so sometime between the 14th of January and the 20th of January, Scanlan decides that he's going to turn the support troops, so I think the cooks, the loggies and the like, he's going to actually form them into 2 new companies that he can use as manoeuvre units. Now, that force has been in place at this point for about 10 months. These are the sorts of questions that you have to go, why wasn't that done 6 months ago? And, they conducted training, every 3 days, half a day of training as a company, as opposed to throwing something together with, we're at D-6 about at this point. It's just it's very difficult to understand how commanders with such combat experience fail to take those sorts of precautions. The other one that I find fascinating is that basically none of these soldiers had conducted a patrol out into the interior of New Britain, and so, as we'll find out, when disaster strikes, they really don't have a feel of the terrain at all, and where they might be able to hide or be evacuated from. It's fascinating to just sort of wonder, what did you do between March and December?
And I suppose you talked about there is a tension there about supporting if the idea is that we're going to support this force for a long time, we need the life support in place from those support elements to be able to sustain it. So you talk to having entertainment and all that sort of stuff, and good food, and food became a contentious point, which you're going to obviously talk about. But I suppose taking the hard ride over the easy wrong and preparing them for the worst, which he knew was inevitable. It obviously didn't seem like it was last safe moment, potentially last moment rather than safe. Is that yeah?
I think so. It's I mean, getting into the mind of a commander who was faced with this sort of a dilemma is difficult, and obviously we have hindsight and all of those things to help us. But some things are inexplicable to our modern minds, I guess, is probably the best way to put it. Okay, so on the 20th of January, then those 4 aircraft carriers that we mentioned, they're in range now. They launch a 100-plane air raid against Rabaul. Most of the Wirraways are shot down at that point, and I think we lose 2 or 3 of the Hudsons during that raid. The 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, there's the 2 of them. They managed to shoot down actually 1 aircraft, which is kind of a pretty good achievement, I would argue, but it's still only 1 out of 100. 21st of January then comes around, and a Catalina, which isn't based at Rabaul, I think it was based more in Port Moresby. So a Catalina is a maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Think an old P8, and they actually managed to spot the invasion force. Now there had been intelligence before that you referred to that indicated that the Australian government knew the invasion force was coming far earlier and withheld that information from Scanlan. But the Catalina manages to get off a signal saying, the invasion force is on a bearing heading towards Rabaul. So this is a really difficult situation, and it's probably brought to life best by looking at the aviation contingent.
Well, and I think the same thing in that, like, we're looking through the eyes of another commander, being Squadron Leader LaRue, who was in charge of 24 Squadron, which is the RAAF element that you're talking about before, sir. But his own superiors at Port Moresby were coming and antagonistic. Soon after the attack, a message from RAF Operations and Signals ordered Squadron Leader LaRue to strike back at the enemy with all available aircraft. Okay, in quotations, all available aircraft. We know now how many aircraft are available. LaRue had 2 Wirraways remaining. One needed repairs and neither was fitted with a universal bomb rack, so not suitable for striking those targets. The lone undamaged Hudson, as he looks out over the flight line and he sees 3 aircraft, one Hudson that was capable, I suppose, of achieving the tactical task. He looks out and decides that will have to do the job, but an absolute suicide mission against the powerful enemy fleet that we know now. We have a bearing from Port Moresby. And we understand the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think actually just dig into how that feels for a second. So that morning, LaRue has lost 6 of his fellow airmen killed. He's got literally no assets, and his higher headquarters faces a political imperative to strike this fleet. And he looks at it and he sees, well, I don't have anything to do that with. I don't know how your morale recovers from that. And I think LaRue sends back a message, we who are about to die salute you. He leverages Russell Crowe's Gladiator, which is extraordinary given that it was 70 years later. But no, I mean, that sort of speaks to the classical education, I think, of probably society at the time, that there was an awareness of that phrase. But I can't imagine how that feels. That's knowing that your government and your higher headquarters simply wants you to expend your life on a futile exercise.
And he sends this Hudson up, and knowing full well that it's likely a suicide mission, and they flew up and then failed to sort of identify any targets from the darkness blanketing the ocean. He comes back, the Hudson comes back, and he's starting to prepare again contingency plans to get the remainder of his injured and ill squadron off the island. And the headquarters again reinforces fires and says their next instruction was to keep the squadron in a combat ready status, and you are ready to attack, ready to attack the Japanese again. He turns to his intelligence officer again, and they come up with that phrase, we who are about to die salute you. I think that's epitomizes where they're at that sort of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you see the tension there between. I think DCA mentioned how being on the ground provides context, and it was pretty clear that the troops, the commanders in Rabaul, had a context that wasn't being understood by Port Moresby and Canberra and Melbourne. Okay, so we that was a brief little diversion into Air Force matters, which is shocking for this podcast. But the 22nd of January, there's even more air raids, and this time there is literally nothing to stop the Japanese. The 3-inch guns are entirely ineffective at this point. There is no more aircraft, and essentially they simply cop it. They cop the offensive support.
I think it's important in the planning side of the house because, as I understand it from the histories, is that the guns were stacked on top of each other, and that was a deliberate sort of.
That was a 6-inch guns, yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously the upper of the 2 guns that were stacked on top of each other gets nailed and then falls onto the lower gun. Maybe geography meant that had to happen, but it instantly meant that the 2 6-inch guns, which were obviously not enough, were relied upon for a short period until they were completely destroyed.
Yeah, so I think Gamble argues that that doctrinally you never put them vertically, but the sighting of the guns was done by inexperienced people who didn't necessarily understand that, and then it all went wrong in contact, as these things can happen.
So we have a 24 squadron completely wiped off, basically off the Orbat, but told to continue to keep fighting. We have 2 6-inch guns, which we argued was predominantly the only sort of defence on the offensive support side for the island. The top one being crumped and fell onto the lower one, completely destroyed and combat ineffective. I suppose, where do we go? You're looking at your options as a commander and they're starting to wane. I suppose you are getting less and less options. What happens next?
Yeah, so Scanlan orders basically everybody to stand to and head to their positions. Now, his concept of battle, if you have a look at the map of Rabaul at the time. Google Earth doesn't actually help you that much with this because there's been a volcanic eruption which has changed the coastline. But if you look at the maps, he essentially digs in a series of company positions around what is a classic bay with one opening. It's a very circular sort of bay, and essentially they dig in. They've got their Vickers machine guns, their Bren guns, their Lewis guns, and they wait. And sorry, they also had their 2-pounders as well, and they wait for the invasion. Now, their total force size, the total of Lark Force, is 1,400 people. They are facing an invasion fleet of 15,000. Now, as they sail through, essentially. It's on the night of the 23rd of January. The defence falls apart really pretty quickly. I mean, there's isolated examples of extreme bravery, as you would imagine, but quite simply, this is an irresistible assault that is occurring on their positions. The 2-pounder guns are mostly ineffective against the Japanese landing craft that are coming in. They only have 2-pounder guns at this point. Only had an armour-piercing round. They're only sort of 25 to somebody will know the exact calibre of a 2-pounder round, but I'm going to say 30 millimetres. Essentially, they're just when they do hit the landing craft, they're just like a big bullet. They take out the couple of people. They put a hole in the side of it, but they don't explode. They don't. There's no high explosive in them, so they don't do an awful lot of damage. And essentially, the Japanese show what they have shown through the Philippines and the Malaya campaign is that they are tenacious, brave, brutal fighters, and they conduct themselves as well as they possibly can through a beach assault at night, and that leads to probably the most shameful action, I would argue, in at least to this point in Australian martial history, and that is that Scanlan actually gives a verbal order that it's now every man for himself, despite the fact that he hasn't put in any contingency plans to enact every man for himself, or what does that actually mean? As you're a soldier staring down the barrel of a Japanese platoon outflanking you, what does every man for himself mean?
And it got to the point where I think importantly his staff officers, Captain Selby we talked about before, but also like a number of different commanders and his staff sort of try to get into his tent to sort of confront him. I suppose not confront, but understand what the plan is in face-to-face. And he refuses to see many of his staff at that sort of point. And he says, I suppose Captain Selby has to come back to his men and say the Colonel's orders are that each man is to fend for himself. That is the every man for himself. Yeah.
Yes. It's a shocking episode. And it's like you look at that and you can see that his conception of battle completely broke down within the first hours of contact. And he was, I would argue pretty clearly at that point, suffering an acute mental health episode of some description where he could no longer function and could no longer give orders. And so he gave that terrible direction and then more or less stuck his head in the sand at what was a crucial moment. Now, again, you get these fantastic vignettes from Gamble about what then the junior officers and NCOs did to take the initiative through that evacuation and withdrawal. But the end result is pretty catastrophic, and that is that essentially they start. Most of them start moving south. Some of them move west over some hills, and start a massive escape and evasion exercise against the Japanese for a period of months.
I suppose months in an environment that is completely unforgiving, which they have not experienced a lot because there was no contingency planning because of the defeatist approach, into a island that has no withdrawal plan. They have not seen the ground or how to sort of live off now limited food stocks, and sort of haven't sort of worked with any of the locals in any of the cities other than Rabaul. An incredibly difficult task, made even more difficult by Colonel Scanlan and a party of 5 leaving and basically withdrawing to the mountains as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I don't use the term desertion lightly, but we're kind of bordering on it here with some of these actions of senior commanders.
He's got a native moving, so he waited the tables in the officers' mess, and then he's carrying like a massive, large kit bag of Colonel Scanlan's equipment to move into the hills and to take sort of somewhat of a position up in the hills and hide, all the while being completely overrun. I suppose you can't put into words how wild that would have been.
Yeah. Now, if we can zoom out for a second before we sort of get into the next phase of this, which is the escape and evasion, some of the actions here. I've tried to think about what could you do if you're an officer in the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months prior to this, with a commander who considers any contingency planning as defeatist. Like I almost think of this like Scanlan's concept for battle was almost, I have a sector of the Western Front, I'm digging in here, and if I'm penetrated, then there is a whole corps or something in my rear able to plug that penetration and continue the fight. But that wasn't what this conflict was about, and like right up until the point, like, you get told that there's an invasion fleet of 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and associated transports, and you don't sort of go, oh, maybe my 1,400 people dug in on this, around this bay isn't going to be an effective use of this force. And so we talk about mission command and thinking about the why of something. The why they were in Rabaul was to delay a Japanese advance further down into the rest of the islands. Now, if you had have taken that why and gone, well, I can't delay on the beaches, like it's not going to work, and start thinking about, okay, well, how can I delay? Maybe I can delay by having the Japanese need to commit a brigade plus or a division to a guerrilla campaign on New Britain. Maybe that's a better use of my force. But he didn't seem to be able to think that. So then that leads you down the path of, well, what could those junior officers have done? And I think that there is a role for junior officers and staff officers to be able to contingency plan and put in place control measures. So, for instance, communicate with Port Moresby through Scanlan, obviously, that, hey, look, worst case scenario here, we need an evacuation on this day every month. We will fly a plane to this bay to work out whether or not there is any Australian forces there. Now, yes, there's security implications to that and the like, but I think that Australian troops and Western troops in general, they need to know that their government and that their people care enough that they would have contingency plans available for an evacuation or something like that.
And I suppose that was not obvious, but yeah, just a wild scenario.
Yeah, I agree. Anyway, that was a quick diversion. I do think that there's a role for a loyal staff officer to play in trying to deal with some of these problems, albeit that I recognise that it does probably, it's a fine tightrope to tread there. Okay, so we then go through, as I sort of described before, the mother of all escape and invasion activities with essentially something like 1,300. The actual soldiers killed in that initial battle, it's 28. It's not a large amount for a force of 1,400, and it's, frankly, nothing compared to what Scanlan had seen as a battalion commander at Mont St Quentin and Amiens. So we've then got 1,300 plus Australian soldiers on the run in New Britain trying to work out what happens. We're talking about small groups. They kind of end up, because of the terrain, a lot of them abandon any of their weapons pretty quickly, really, which again I think is probably a consequence of an order like every man for himself. That doesn't imply that we're going to fight. That implies run away,
like survive rather than continue to thrive or fight, I suppose, until the end. It's more like no, you are now in survival mode. Go into this island that you've never seen before because we didn't do any sort of recce's or anything on foot, and literally hide out until such time as Australia somewhat comes with a plan.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, though, isn't there? There is no plan. So as you sort of go from 1 week of trying to survive on a bit of taro or whatever it is that you can find because you haven't cached food out there for the troops, as you go through those sort of phases of hunger and everything else, and you know that there's no actual plan to evacuate, well, what do you do? And a lot of them ended up surrendering to the Japanese. The Japanese are obviously launching their own PSYOPs campaign with leaflets being dropped and a whole bunch of other things saying you need to surrender. Now that's obviously them trying to make sure that they don't have to spend a whole lot of resources on a mopping up campaign. But we also get some shocking incidents of massacres as well in there.
I suppose we're talking about, surrendering and somewhat. I mean, to surrender, they must have been at completely last, that's it. Then they surrender, and there's a number of stories in the actual book talking about how Australian soldiers are basically telling the Japanese, begging for them to shoot them so they aren't bayoneted, because that was the normal, I suppose, when you get to these camps and you walked out into the jungle from these small towns, locals included, but also Australian soldiers and officers, to be sort of walked out into the jungle and then bayoneted was the standard practice. And these soldiers standing in front of Japanese soldiers begging to be shot so they weren't bayoneted to death, I suppose. That's what we're talking about here, I suppose.
No, that is absolutely true, and we're talking, of hundreds of examples of that. We're not just talking, isolated incidents. We're talking, command-initiated execution of prisoners. The really, now this is an aside, but the really interesting thing for me is that because the Japanese troops were inexperienced, they were actually trying to use it as some sort of battle inoculation process. But that also meant that they were a bit crap at it, at actually bayoneting somebody to death, and they left quite a few survivors.
And there was stories of people who survived or told stories and then passed it back through the survivors of them lying on the ground being bayoneted through the neck because they missed their head or chest or whatever, and then basically trying to hold their breath for as long as they could on the ground to fake and surviving as a result of that, faking death, but horrible wounds with no health care support, and then now going back into a jungle that was already arduous, now with a open wound in your neck region, having just fainted faked your death for as long as you could by holding your breath, covering yourself with other bodies. It's insane, the amount of where we got to.
It is, and it's probably good to lend a shout out here to the Melanesian population of New Guinea at this point, because it was them, along with some missionaries, who ended up being able to nurse some of these people back to health, who were then able to attest to these atrocities that occurred. One other aside that I found fascinating through this escape and evasion is that the fact that, stemming back to pre-1914, there'd obviously been a bunch of Germans in New Britain, plantation owners and the like, and the fact that they very quickly reverted to their German heritage and Axis partnership and tried to assist the Japanese and welcome the Japanese coming to the island. Interesting to see how deep those sorts of national roots ran within those people.
But that was ultimately, I suppose, when they did surrender and it seemed like it was, too much of a burden to move back to a larger camp where the Japanese were keeping people. Inside the camps, though, the conditions were not they were still as bad as, I'm not going to say to the point of being bayoneted as practice, but the conditions inside the camps were absolutely terrible as well. So surrender seemed like the last option, but also a absolutely terrible option in itself.
Yeah, which I think is a reflection of no food, right? If you don't have any food, then you need to do something to eat, and surrender seems like a good option. There's a great scene where Gamble describes Scanlan's decision to surrender, where essentially he, you mentioned before he had porters take his big kit bag. And he puts on his red tabs and starts marching back up the track to go and surrender with a small group of people. I can't remember exactly how many, but we're talking 3 to 5, I think, of his people. So look, the end result of this escape and evasion activity is that about 1,000 Australians surrender. Something like 300 end up getting away. With both some float planes, but also some small launches coming across from Papua New Guinea, particularly before the Japanese have landed at Lae and started the march down the Kokoda track. They were able to get a few people off because the Australians were still in control of the main island of Papua New Guinea, the northern part of the main island of Papua New Guinea. But then a handful also stayed on the island and essentially acted as coast watchers and with the local population tried to provide information back to Australia on what the Japanese were doing on New Britain. Rabaul became the linchpin of force projection for the Japanese into both Papua New Guinea and also the Solomons. The command in Rabaul had an area of operations that basically spanned from Papua New Guinea through to Guadalcanal and a bit beyond. So that it was used and heavily reinforced by the Japanese to the point that that the MacArthur initially wanted to assault it, but he ended up realising that actually I can just isolate it. And by the end of the war in 1945, I think the figure is something like there was still 100,000 Japanese on Rabaul in and around Rabaul as part of that garrison force. I think probably we need to talk about what then happened to the PWs that were taken. So the Japanese had a problem with labour, and the PWs that they took through those initial campaigns in the Pacific, both American, British, Indian and Australian, they ended up using them as forced labour all over the Japanese Empire. And essentially they would put them on ships and transport them on these ships to where they decided that they would need the labour. So, for instance, of course, Hellfire Pass in Thailand building a railway is a famous example of this. So this is what happens to Lark Force and the troops that are on Rabaul. So there's 800 soldiers and 200 civilians put on a ship called the Montevideo Maru.
And I suppose they're in the point where that put onto the ship is an incredibly sterile description of them being held in the lower cargo holds of this ship. Many suffering from dysentery from eating things that they were not used to, and being in confined spaces in a PW camp. There is literally people explosive diarrhea in these cargo holds of this ship. All 1,000 people in 2 compartments locked in by the Japanese inside this ship. Then I suppose we move to they start to steam back towards Japan, and a US submarine identifies this ship as a Japanese, something that is assisting the Japanese, and then sort of identifies it as a target. The CO of this submarine then prepares to engage this target, knowing not knowing that there's 1,000 innocent lives in two cargo holds or compartments underneath this ship. He fires a torpedo and hits this ship, and it begins to sink immediately. The Japanese on top of the ship, there was a very small crew sort of staffing this ship to get back to the more resourced Japan. They immediately use the life rafts that are available to evacuate off the ship just themselves, and they start to make land, but the two compartments are still completely sealed, and that ship, obviously being struck, falls to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think like you've hit on, I guess, the reason that they were locked in. The Japanese were faced with a problem. Their solution was inhumane. Now, the Montevideo Maru was actually found just in April of 2023 and announced as one of the key war grave sites found by Australia in the last few years, and I think it's a fantastic find that is testament to the tenacious character of our own country in trying to best honour our war dead, and maybe we can reflect on perhaps the government could have played a different role prior to this, so that there weren't quite so many war dead. Do we want to talk about takeaways now?
I think that it's hard to transition from that sort of point to useful takeaways. But yeah, I think that's probably the most important point, is to talk about 3 takeaways. You talked about trying to avoid this ever happening again, or the same circumstance happening again. But I suppose, yeah, what are the sort of, if you've got 3 key takeaways for Rabaul in itself and the entire plan and how it unfolded, what are they, sir?
Okay, so as I was reading this, the first one actually seems really banal at the moment, given that we've just spoken about 1,000 people dying in the hold of a ship. But I'll start at the start. So a denial strategy in the World War II context meant that we were in location first in order to deny. Now, DCA sort of spoke about in modern warfare, it would seem that if your adversary can get a jump on you, I think was a phrase that he used, and actually seize territory, it can be incredibly hard to wedge them out. And he used Ukraine as sort of an example where Russia was able to take swathes of eastern Ukraine and then hold it. Now, if we think about how you might combat that if your strategy is denial, certainly the answer that they came up to in World War II was you need to be there first. Now, it was Australian territory, so we could be there first, and we went there in March. But the key lesson for me was how hard it was keeping the morale of soldiers who were deployed on an indefinite duration mission up. It's really, really hard. Now, the things that Gamble sort of highlights and that Rabaul had a cinema that was really, really well patronised. The battalion had a band that would put on shows regularly. They had access to local markets to supplement their diet. They had beer. Routinely would be able to have parties. They also were welcome to go on dates with the army nurses that were there. So fraternisation, I suppose, although he certainly doesn't comment that there's any sexual activity going. It's more just female companionship in what is a largely single-sex force. Church was really important, and they also organised things like crocodile hunting trips. Food also became a significant source of discontent in the force just due to its repetition. So if we think about those things and then transpose onto a modern force, how would we keep a modern force entertained and interested if they're on an indefinite duration deployment? Are those things still open to us to use? Are some of them closed, such as drinking on operations, for instance? Do we have to look at changing that if we're talking about putting people there? I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think they're questions that we need to ask. Feeding the force is also really important. Our cooks at the moment are below strength. What does that mean to a force that might need to spend a year or more waiting for a battle that may never come, and we hope doesn't come, given what we've just seen here. So that's my first one, and I'm sorry that it is a bit loggy based, I guess, but hell, I'm a loggy. The other key takeaway, and this one comes from those Lend-Lease promises from the Americans. My other key takeaway there is that the promises of our allies are subject to their own circumstances. The promises of our allies are subject to their own circumstances. So I think what that means is that for us, contemplating what happens in a regional conflict, if we needed to expand our force, I think it's difficult to say that we could guarantee the supply of the high-end weapons, the types that we're buying right now from our allies. It's not a definite no or anything. It's just that they will be guided by their own circumstances, and we can't control that. And then my last thing, and this one I think is a little bit dark, and you sort of think about what this force went through, and that is that the political need doesn't wait for your boutique capability to reach IOC or FOC, and neither does your enemy. You fight with what you've got, where your government and when your government tells you to as an army. And, obviously in this case, this ended very, very badly for the people involved. But I think we would be naive to think that couldn't happen again.
I think that is an excellent point. And yeah, you talked about this episode is far more, I suppose, exactly what the DCO was talking about in terms of, the realities of trying to make decisions in the most dire of circumstances. And I think not assuming that sort of those circumstances will never be expected of you ever again. And awesome episode. Thank you so much, sir. And this is the continuity as we weave other guests in. This series serves as a continuity inside the COL podcast. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.